Welcome to Beyond the Bee, an ongoing dialogue about the past, present, and future of the B Corp movement. Co-hosts Emmy Allison and Ryan Honeyman facilitate an open and honest conversation about the B Corp movement, advise companies on how to increase their impact, and provide a deep dive into the new B Corp standards that are shaping our community.
My guest today is Kevin Bayuk. Kevin works at the intersection of ecology and economy, where permaculture design meets next economy organizations intent on meeting human needs while enhancing the conditions conducive to all life. Kevin is the co-founder and my partner at Lift Economy. He's also an impact investment strategist for River 6 Foundation. He's a former senior financial fellow at Project Drawdown and a founding partner of the Urban Permaculture Institute in San Francisco. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Ryan.
Yeah, I brought Kevin on because over the years, Kevin has been involved with B Corps, not quite as long as I have, but has definitely been in and out of the movement before. And what I wanted to speak with Kevin about was this idea of going beyond B Corp and how we can really go expand the movement's impact. And maybe before we jump into how that might work or what it looks like, et cetera, Kevin, would you just speak a little bit about how did you, if you can remember, how did you first come across B Corps and what was your experience like them maybe in the early days?
The first time I heard of B Corps was, I believe Jay and maybe one of the other founders was at an event with Paul Hawken. I was attending. It was some type of roundtable discussion at Fort Mason in San Francisco. And the thing that stood out to me was the emphasis on kind of some type of statutory change to enable benefit corporation statutes, and that there would be, I don't even recall at that moment if the certification or the B impact assessment had been developed or considered. But the idea, the theory of change I heard was, hey, shareholder primacy is a big problem or the problem to tackle, and nothing short of having some new form of statutes would enable corporations to navigate towards more holistic or better outcomes for society and the environment. And then along the way, I remember the announcement, New Leaf Paper, and maybe it was Numi Tea and Opticos Design and Patagonia and a few others, whoever the founding B Corps were. I remember that press release, and that grabbed my attention. I said, okay, this is a real thing. It's a movement. And then it was a few years later when I learned about the B, maybe a couple years later, that I learned about the B impact assessment. And then I really didn't give it a ton of attention until, Ryan, we met. And I think you invited me to an event, maybe it was at San Francisco State or something like that. And I remember
the first
going.
Build.
That was the first build. Okay. Yeah, I remember attending that. I remember meeting Allison May, former CEO of Patagonia, and that was when I first really kind of got up to speed as to where the movement was at the time.
Yeah, and we can be honest about some of your initial critiques of the B Corp movement. So when we first met, you were like, "Well, B Corps are cool, but let's be real." And what were kind of your thoughts in those
yeah, well, this is before you joined Lift Economy. Sean Berry and I would talk about B Corp movement, and we looked at the companies that were signing up, and it was some companies that we knew or had worked with in some capacity. And for us, B Corp certification meant, we internally jokingly, we'd say B is less bad. Less bad, implying that it's kind of a harm reduction strategy. If kind of the general observation is that certainly multinationals or public equity corporations or larger corporations with a shareholder mandate, a shareholder primacy mandate, their actions, their structure and operational actions lead to externalities, which is a term for social and environmental harm, then constraining some of those activities by enabling decision making to have benefits for society and the environment. And then, of course, certifying by measuring the practices and policies and operational outcomes against some standard. To us, that seemed like a step forward, but not an adequate step for what seemed necessary to actually address the enormity of the social and environmental harms that had already been created as well by the economy and were also continuing to be created. So harm reduction, yes. A step forward, yes. We sometimes say the B Corp movement seemed to us to be essential, but wholly inadequate for the transformation that's necessary to a livable future for humanity. And so we have respect for everybody involved with the B Corp movement. I mean, Lyft Economy became a certified B Corp. We, of course, became enamored with you, Ryan, and wanted to hire you on as a worker owner partner. So there's a lot of reasons that we're involved with the B Corp community. And I still today see it as an important step forward, but wholly inadequate for the transformation that's necessary.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was, I will admit, for me at the time, I thought B Corps were like, oh, this is it. This is what we need to actually change things. And so it was helpful to get more of your take. So maybe if someone is saying, well, sure, they're maybe not enough, but aren't they really important? How do you sort of take a couple double clicks into your critique? Like, what are some of the structural changes you think we need to see? And then how does B Corp does or does not actually affect that?
Yeah, and I might end up asking you some questions too, Ryan, to reflect on the status of it. Is it still true today that there's only a handful of publicly traded B Corps?
Yeah, there's probably maybe less than 100. Yeah,
less than 100.
I mean,
okay.
Yeah. Well, I'm talking about globally. So there's like
globally,
maybe like 50 or 60 across the
like
world.
50 or 60, right? And so by any measure, a tiny fraction of kind of the corporate activities and public equity exchange companies are organized under statutes that enable decision makers to make decisions that affect not just shareholders, but whatever their benefit statements are legally requiring the decision makers to privilege. And so most of the economic activity, a tremendous amount of economic activity is, and, there's lots of data around, even if you look at harms around what corporations are responsible for global greenhouse gas emissions inventory, right? And so it's some of these larger multinational corporations, what corporations are implicated in any of the planetary boundaries. 6 of 9 have been exceeded now by the last accounting. You look at where the responsibility lies from policies and operations, it's a lot of the larger corporations. So in that regard, B Corp with over 9,000, 8,000, 9,000, again, you tell me where I'm wrong on the magnitude, Ryan, of certified B Corps are unlikely to have much of an impact on the things that are driving an existential crisis for humanity in terms of the deleterious outcomes from the business as usual economy. So the deeper double clicking on the critique, I mean, again, I'm going to say the things that I think are important. This idea of inspiring a change around the purpose of business to actually not just serve shareholders, very important. And having a global community that's growing, 8, 9,000, maybe someday 20,000, maybe someday 100,000 businesses that have said, yes, we are organizing under statutes or requiring ourselves to consider more than just shareholders as a return on our decision making. Very important. So that community, I heard Kat Taylor, maybe it was at that first build or a later one, share that at Beneficial State Bank, just going through the B impact assessment and the detailed questions was a forcing function for them to consider policies and operational concerns that they hadn't had on their radar at all. So I think in that way, the B impact assessment as something to inspire somebody to consider, like, wow, I hadn't really thought that human rights could be factored into our business in that way, or we could have a whistleblower policy, or whether it's minutia details in terms of policies or maybe, wow, what would we need to do for our business model to be recognized as something that's creating beneficial impact in the world? Just asking those questions makes the impact assessment and the kind of ipso facto the B Corp community a very useful and meaningful contribution as a step forward. But when I look at the community composition, I might be looking at slightly older data, maybe a year ago or whatever. I think over half of B Corps are service companies. So not a tremendous amount of materiality in their impacts. Not to say that service companies don't have an impact on the world, but when we look at environmental or social justice harms, how labor is treated, a lot of the material goods companies in the world have a significant impact through extraction of raw materials, value adding or manufacturing processes, transportation, waste for planned obsolescence and wanton consumption and end of life for materials. All of those things are that linear throughput business as usual economy, which oftentimes orients around durable and consumable goods. That's not as well represented, I think, in the B Corp community. And that's where most of the bad impacts are happening in the world. And so celebrating that there's thousands of certified B Corps is important, but with at least half of them being kind of service with minor environmental footprint, that means that it's hard for me to see B Corp certification as anything but just harm reduction, just a little bit less bad. Also, I think a majority B Corps have some like 85% by my last measure have less than 250 employees. That was, again, end of 2023 data. So these are, even in the world of business as usual economy, that would be considered small business, not even medium, though SME or medium enterprise, maybe in that 250 or 300 or 1,000 person company. But so it would be unfair or blunt to say certified B Corps are small companies without a big footprint. So I'm glad they're doing better or less bad, but who cares? That's way too blunt and kind of an oversimplification. But I think that would be some of the, when I say B Corps are a step forward, but not adequate to the transformation that's necessary, those are some of the things that come to mind. When we start going through some of the characteristics, what would the characteristics be of a institution, say a company or a business or an enterprise, that was adequate or commensurate to the needs for a livable future for humanity? When we go through some of those features, we'll see that some B Corps might actually have some of those features embedded into their structure or operations or policies. Many of them do not. So I guess that's another way to say is you can operate a B Corp that's a certified B Corp that meets the standards and not necessarily be oriented towards or aspiring towards optimal beneficial impact. It's kind of the nature of anything that has a certification in general. It's like, okay, if I meet the standards, then I can claim. In the course of B Corp certification, I think it's largely driven in part, at least, by a consumer-facing orientation. It's like, oh, I can put that label on my products or my services, as the case may be. And so that drives a lot of interest. And I think there's been some resources expended to try and promote the B Corp label as something that consumers have some awareness of. And that's something that's celebrated. However, as you can imagine, that creates somewhat of a perverse incentive to be like, okay, what can I do if I want the consumer-facing label? What can I do as a company that enables me to get that label, but only to the minimum of what I have to do, rather than authentically aspiring to a purpose of transforming the nature of the economy such that it would be compatible with a livable future? The orientation is like, what's the minimum I need to do to be able to put this label on my goods or services? And that minimum it's less bad. It's a step forward, but I would say, again, kind of wholly inadequate to the task of our time.
That's helpful, Kevin. So I think maybe where it might be useful to go is then, yeah, what would it look like if a company was trying to do some of these things that could optimize, for future beneficial impact while also running a going concern that doesn't go bankrupt, right? Balancing
Totally.
those things.
Yeah, and I think that's the part of that what's the orientation towards the purpose of enterprise? It makes us think about the purpose of the economy, at the highest level, kind of first principles. Why do we have institutions like businesses or enterprises? Theoretically, we have them to meet needs, to provide goods and services to communities that authentically meet their needs. What's, I think, self-evidently happened, and you could tell me if I'm crazy here, is that the attraction of creating profits or extracting profits for financial gain, and then sometime in the 20th century, determining through tools of media and through even psychological analysis that businesses have developed tools to manufacture demand so that consumers become disconnected from what they actually need, things like food or nutrition, water, shelter, maybe clothing for comfort, and these types of basic needs, to having artificial or manufactured demand for things that don't meet their needs. And a tremendous amount of the economy is now oriented around provisioning goods or services that aren't authentically dedicated to the well-being of people or meeting their needs or serving the environment, but are dedicated to how can we create optimal transactions to generate high margin financial gains for owners or shareholders. And when I look at the list of B Corps and just with a lens, and I encourage anybody to do this, is like look at any of the B Corps and say, and it's subjective. So I'm not saying I'm the arbiter of this, but I encourage you to do the thought experiment and say, like, does this company meet a core need for humanity? And again, you might look at it and say, sure, I guess so. Yeah, why not? Or as you go through the list and look at different companies and their products, and I won't name companies. I just want you all to do the experiment. And you might say, like, well, yeah, some of them definitely, they're trying to provide high quality nutrition or personal care products for sanitation, or they're providing waste management services for the community. But some of them you might find like, if this company didn't exist, is it really essential to meeting human needs? I think that's the first trap that we see, is many companies kind of slipstream into the manufactured demand kind of paradigm because that's what's taught in business schools. Like, that's good business. Start a business that you think people will transact on, not start a business to address a core need. If you can manipulate or manufacture a need through marketing and media manipulation and urgency and scarcity messaging and so forth, then that's considered good business in Business 101. So whether the product has tons of sugar in it and actually creates psychological dependency, or those are externalities and the social ills and harms that come from that in terms of health costs and so forth, or other social harms, those are not incorporated into the purpose of a business. So needed goods and services, it sounds very simple, but like that's one of the principles that we talk about in our Next Economy MBA, as you know, Ryan.
Maybe we should go through the 10 principles to sort of.
Sure. Well, yeah, that would be the first one, actually. Need-oriented basic goods and services. There is a gray area there as to what is needed, but it's the first discerning lens that orients a company from the question of how can I make money versus how can I actually solve a problem for my community or communities. Solving a problem that is more basic to what's essential to life is kind of one of the first orientations. And then a second orientation, and you'll already start to hear why this is difficult, is making sure that the ownership of the economic benefits is inclusive. So inclusive ownership is a principle that we talk about for next economy institutions. That can look a lot of ways. Certainly, there are some B Corps where it's not owned by a founder or founders, or where it's not owned by some combination of founders and shareholders, but where the ownership of the organization is owned by the workers. So a worker-owned cooperative. There's about 1,000 worker-owned cooperatives or so in the United States today, and some of those are certified B Corps, a small percentage. Worker ownership is an example of inclusive ownership. There are other organizations where the ownership is not just the labor, but actually the community as well. So members of the community through public offerings of a sort of different types. I'm not saying necessarily listed on NASDAQ or New York Stock Exchange, where it's a public equity kind of exchange, but actually where offerings can be made to the public, directly to the public in community settings where community members own some of the economic benefits. It's also there could be other types of cooperatives where some of the producers could own some of the economic benefits of the organization. And again, there are B Corps. Divine Chocolate comes to mind. Are they a certified B Corp, Ryan?
Yeah.
Pachamama Coffee.
I think Tillamook is cooperatively owned by their producers.
By producers, yeah. Pachamama Coffee is like a farmer-owned cooperative as an example, and I think they are also a certified B Corp, if I'm not mistaken. So there are companies.
East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative.
East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative, for sure. These multi-stakeholder cooperatives. And why is this important? Well, if you look at wealth inequality, go to inequality.org and look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics kind of statistics that they show there. And you'll see these huge disparities in wealth along lines of identity, certainly, and just the magnitude, just the crushing poverty, even here in the United States. If you're not intimate with the existence of poverty, then and you live in quote unquote one of the bubbles, or maybe an urban area or a suburban area where you might not be close to it, it might be hard to acknowledge or know how impoverished the wealthiest nation in the world, the history of the world, how impoverished people are. And that level of poverty, how do we get out of that poverty? Well, in the same time that poverty keeps on increasing and inequality keeps on increasing, corporate profits, if you take a longitudinal view, are at record pace. Well, okay, just in your mind's eye, if you could imagine those profits, those economic gains being distributed back to all the community members who are consuming or participating in the economy, then we would have a much different world. The excessive profit taking and wealth building, it would be some form of distribution. Well, that sounds Pollyannish and silly, like, oh, let's just redistribute the wealth, and people start talking about pitchforks and revolution and this kind of thing. Well, we don't necessarily need pitchforks and revolution if the structure of the economic entities structurally takes any surplus that's generated and puts that surplus back in the hands of labor or the community or multiple parties, rather than concentrating that wealth into shareholders or founders who tend to be fewer. There's some nuance there because, there are a large number of Americans, not universal as an example in America, who have retirement savings. I mean, it's measured in tens of trillions of dollars, and that's in pensions and 401ks and IRAs. And a lot of that resource is invested in public equities. So theoretically, the ownership of some of these public equity companies is theoretically a large portion of the public. However, the intermediary structure of having these pensions and some of the funds that are kind of representing their investors, public, they tend to represent that pressure on companies for maximizing earnings, maximizing margin. So a company basically feels forced to make decisions that privilege their share price or their future potential to generate earnings such that they stay in favor with the large investors, lowering their overall cost of capital, or if they want to do it. Subsequent offerings to their initial offering, they don't dilute their whole base of ownership. CEOs are compensated, leadership C-suites are compensated to maximize the shareholder value. And that theoretically should contribute to the wealth of the population at large. But it's not, it doesn't, because the percentage of people who have this meaningful stake in ownership is relatively few. It's smaller than the total. And so structurally, we should do different. I want to double click though on that, like shareholder primacy. Like, why is it a problem? Because I've tried to find a way to tell this story to like try and elucidate the challenge, the structural challenge of the business as usual economy. Because people might defend capitalism and defend business as usual economic structures like public equity exchanges, and I want to share like why I think it's problematic or structurally problematic. And there's lots of reasons I could point to, but sometimes I think telling a story is, if you could put your mind in the shoes of a senior vice president executive at a public company where their main products are chocolate or related or something like that. And the senior vice president, she's in charge of supply web, so their supply chain and all their brokers, and which includes like cacao farmers and so forth in different countries. And imagine she finds out someday that, hey, one of our brokers has, some investigative journalist reported that they're actually employing child labor, right? So children are in the supply chain of the cacao for our products. One would imagine that the moral choice for the person, the senior vice president, would be like, what do we need to do? Let's change brokers. Maybe there's a broker that has documented history of fair trade practices, or they're certified. Let's change to another supplier so that we don't have children in our supply web. Now, if you imagine the senior vice president making that decision, well, that decision has consequences, right? So one of the consequences of making that decision probably is to choose the fair trade supply, is that the price of the cacao is actually going to be higher than the cacao from the broker where there's less oversight over they're not certified fair trade or fair labor in any way. And so that price of the cacao is now higher. And if that's a big significant portion of the final products of this company, then its overall profit margins as a company are going to go down, right? Because the price is higher. They probably haven't changed the price of their products to compete in the marketplace at the grocers and their distribution points. So that means their profit forecast would go down. And so somewhere along the line here, the CFO and the CEO and so forth will find out about this decision, in some manner, whether proactively or reactively, and be like, wait a minute, what's going on here? Our guidance that we gave to Wall Street in terms of our profits that we gave to investors through our public disclosure said that we were going to orient towards this profit. Now our margin is being squeezed. What's going on here? We can't have that decision. So what happens in practice? Well, the senior vice president probably already knows this, but let's just do this counterfactual for a moment. The CEO and the CFO, they fire that senior vice president, replace it with somebody who makes the immoral decision to look the other way and to have the children labor in the supply web. But let's just imagine for a moment in this thought experiment that the CEO and the CFO also have this moral struggle and are like, wait a minute, despite the guidance we gave to Wall Street and to the investment world, we're going to make the moral decision. We're going to take a stand here. And over the next quarter or two, our margins are going to suffer. Our guidance on our profit is going to be different in reality, and that variance might cause our share price to drop. But we're going to take the moral stand to do the thing that we should do, right? And nobody wants children working in their supply chain. Well, when the board hears about this, right, the board of directors, whose fiduciary legal, if you will, responsibility is to shareholders, the board might say, CEO, CFO, C-suite, what are you doing here? Our share price is going to crater if we, compromise our margin on our largest product offerings. So the board would then fire the CEO and CFO and replace them with the ones that would fire the senior vice president or whatever, and replace them so that the immoral decision is the one that is made because of this primacy of margin or impact, margin and financial gain. Well, okay, let's do the thought experiment where the senior vice president, the CEO, the CFO, and the board of directors are all aligned morally that this is a morally reprehensible decision. Well, then the aforementioned 401k pension plans, the shareholders would see that the stock price is cratering, right? First, they might flee to invest in other, to make it the cost of capital for that company to go up and for their share price to continue to tumble. But if they got their act together, the shareholders would probably fire the board because they elect the board and elect a board that's going to make the immoral, quote unquote, the right decision from a business as usual perspective to fire the CEO and CFO, who would then fire the senior vice president. So the system has this almost immune system, if you will, to lead to 97% of the old growth in the Northern Hemisphere to be clear cut. For 95% of the fish in the sea to be large fish and the pelagics in the sea to be overfished, for 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries to be excluded. So whether we're talking about child labor or polluting waterways or mountaintop removal, or take anything that has documented environmental or social harms that you and I might consider with the words like immoral, the system is actually insulated or has an immune system to actually almost force immoral decisions. And if you make the moral decisions in most cases, let's take it outside of that kind of straw person caricature chocolate company, public equity company, and take it to a smaller company like most of the B corporations, certified B Corps. And if you make decisions that are moral, I'm going to pay beyond the mandated minimum wage because the minimum wage is not adequate actually for people to survive in America. There's, so much poverty based on wages. So I'm going to pay more. I'm going to find the suppliers, only the suppliers that are doing regenerative, organic, certified, fair for life, fair trade, the best suppliers of all the raw ingredients. I'm going to, and we'll talk about some of the other things that they might do. I'm going to make all the good decisions. You would find that the price, that the cost to create the goods, say it was chocolate or whatever it might be, is going to come out higher than the business as usual corporations without that moral orientation. And so the price of the goods in the marketplace, the ones that are making the good decisions, if you will, the moral decisions, will find that their price is much higher than the business as usual because their cost basis was much higher. In order to achieve something like price parity, then either they would have to have a small margin, or what happens in most cases is just not feasible. So they don't survive as a business or an enterprise. And so we actually call that lift economy the price parity paradox. Is how does a company that wants to do all the things, we haven't even talked about all the things, but the company that wants to do all the right, moral, just, regenerative policies, operations, and structures, the company that wants to do that usually is faced with a challenge where in a business as usual competitive marketplace of goods or services, that their goods or services are going to be priced higher in order to survive. And that's extraordinarily problematic. And that's, again, the structural kind of constraints on the economy. What are the things? We started talking about the next economy principles. Inclusive ownership is one. Another example that we talk about a lot is this idea of equitable and democratic culture.
One quick question, though, Kevin, on
Sure.
on the
Please.
public equities example.
Mm-hmm.
I think many listeners might say, well, that's the purpose of the benefit corporation legal structure, right? Is to give the board and the CEO and the CFO that protection that you couldn't have an activist investor come in and fire everybody, and because you'd be protected.
Yeah. And how many public equity companies are B Corps? What was the answer? You said it earlier.
Like 50 or 60.
50,
yeah.
Okay, so like 50, yeah. Right. So
And there's never been, as far as I know, there's never been a public a decision, like a benefit corporation decision.
Hasn't happened yet. It may be. I want to concede that benefit corporation statutes, I think that's what I first heard about the movement. And I agree, we need something different than this specter of fiduciary kind of responsibility to shareholder primacy, whether that's cultural or statutory, I think is open for debate. But having new statutes that allow for companies to, or even force their hand to make more holistic decisions that consider additional stakeholders, super important. It's just in practice today in 2024, after over 10 years of a B Corp movement, to have less than 50 or so public certified B Corps or public benefit corporations for that matter. Is that meaningful? Is that enough to transform the nature of the economy? I would argue it's important, maybe even essential, but wholly inadequate.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And we could point to Unilever, what's been happening there the last 6 months, from this, like, hey, you could be a public company and consider more than just profits and not be a benefit corporation. But we saw the board come in and the activist investors, and now Unilever's kind of at chaos. There's like no sustainable.
They spun out Ben and Jerry's or some of the brands that they might have acquired at some point. Yeah. Yeah. So essential, but wholly inadequate comes to mind. What else could a company do? Well, there's a couple, maybe we could run through some additional things. So one principle we talk about is equitable and democratic culture. And this does happen. If you look at certified B Corps, there are B Corps that have either structurally or operationally incorporated more shared power type of dialogue, deliberation, and decision-making processes into the company. Why is this important at all? Well, if you did a poll, and I don't know how many years ago it was, but one of my mentors mentioned that Pew had done some research, maybe it was in the 80s, about how many people would like to have a say, some type of decision-making stake in what goes on at work. And it was like one of the most universally resounding absolute yeses to any poll research around workforce that had ever been produced, which led one of my mentors to talk about like worker ownership in some way in terms of governance is the sleeping giant of the economy. It's that people want to have some voice in terms of their workplace, in terms of what policies or what decisions are made, and that there's a latent desire to be involved in that way. That may or may not be true. I mean, I'm open to that being true. I think it is true. But what we do know from a lived economy is when workers or community members are involved authentically in some type of democratic process, a couple things happen. One, those external harms that tend to happen where decision making is siloed to fewer and fewer hands, those tend to not happen. So when workers or community members are involved in the decision making, you tend to get decisions that benefit workers or benefit the community rather than those that just benefit shareholders. So just having some structural way or operational way to have democratic process is really important. Maybe more importantly is one thing we've noticed working with a lot of worker-owned cooperatives where there is some democratic process. And it doesn't mean, when I say worker-owned cooperative, people are like, does that mean every decision every worker is involved in making? That's kind of an ignorant kind of caricature or straw person kind of like characterization of democratic culture. Democratic culture could involve representation, be it through like some type of voting or hiring process. It could mean delegative authority, where there's certain decisions are made where certain people are granted rights to make decisions, but they are then accountable to the collective, the co-op, the company, the community. And so that if they make bad decisions, the power to change the executor, if you will, of the decision making is in the power of the workers or the community or the different stakeholders. When we say democratic process, we don't mean just voting and electoral politics within companies, these kind of strange. And we don't just mean everybody has consensus and kumbaya around every decision, like what color should we paint the wall and where should we hang the bulletin board. It doesn't mean that everybody's involved in those decisions. It means that there's some form of deliberate practice of dialogue, deliberation, and decision making that is more sharing power. Why we think that's important beyond just better decisions get made is that we find that most people, especially in America, have little to no practice in their day-to-day lived experience of making shared decisions, choices with other people. They grew up in a family where mom or dad made the decisions. They went to school where the teacher told them, the principal told them what the rules are and what we're studying and how to succeed. And then they got a job where the boss told them what success is and what to do. And so this idea of like, go back to your neighborhood and get together with your neighbors and find out what are the priorities for our neighborhood. Let's make good decisions together about what we want to see in our neighborhood. And that tends to not work that well because people have no experience at in our Next Economy MBA, some people have said the only experience they've had in collective decision making is getting together with a group of friends and deciding where they want to have dinner together or what movie to see. And they said even that's hard. And so, I think the expectation that we could have a democratic culture for governance, for collective sense making and coordination at a society level is an unrealistic expectation when most people have had very little experience in a democratic setting, in their day-to-day life. So having it in the workplace is a fairly radical, can have, and we've witnessed it have a radical transformative effect on people's lives. So the person who has day-to-day practice doing some dialogue, deliberation, and decision making, when they become part of their neighborhood association and people are like, how should we decide what to do about the road or the trash or public safety of kids getting to school? It's like the people who actually work in some type of cooperative setting or some type of democratic setting, they're like, I guess I know how this works. So let me facilitate some dialogue and proposal generation. And okay, how are we going to make this decision? Are we going to do it by consensus, consent? Are we going to do supermajority, or simple majority voting? And there's a literacy about like how to engage in decision making and governance that unfortunately is just not taught in our education system or is not common in society. So workplaces become this like Trojan horse for spreading literacy and competence in group coordination. So it's a very important part of what a company can do. So kind of, I guess what I'm pointing to is any B Corp that is not either structurally being incorporating as a co-op in some form, or having in their bylaws a process where workers or community members elect their representatives to the board or that type of thing. Some process, some democratic process structurally, or it could be operational. The Frederick Laloux, I know you've interviewed Ryan for our Next Economy Now, wrote that book, Reinventing Organizations, which highlights some good case studies of organizations that practice some self-management practices where structurally they might be a power over hierarchical kind of corporation structure, but operationally they have teams where there are democratic processes to make better decisions and practice more democratic process. So it doesn't have to be structural, it can be operational or both.
Great. Should we jump in at number 4?
Sure, let's do it. So supporting the local economy ecosystem is what we talk about as the 4th principle of Next Economy institutions. And the idea of local has to do with kind of like this notion that one of the overcorrections of the business as usual economy, with its reliance on the notion of economies of scale, which really relies on at least when you're talking about a continental perspective, multi-continental perspective, global perspective, relies on cheap transportation energy. So to fossil fuel historically, relatively cheap. The idea of a 6-continent supply chain or supply web where goods or services, there's multiple extraction points from multiple communities around the world, and then there are some value adding materials and things are shipped all over the world. When I say overcorrection, if like you looked at your local region and asked, looking at the clothing and the food and the materials that are used to build shelters or homes or repair homes, and you said, what percentage of these goods were created from the local region within 150 miles or within 200 miles. I mean, each region is going to have a different scale. My guess is that you would find a very, in North America or the United States, as an example, so-called the United States, you'd find a very small percentage of those goods were actually resourced, extracted, or recycled, or developed, manufactured in the local region. By a very small percentage, I don't actually know exactly what to guess, because food is oftentimes there's a local food, but I'd say less than 5% of overall goods, a tiny percentage. And so we know that for when supply webs break down, whether from kinetic warfare, like what's happening in Ukraine today, or from global respiratory viral pandemics like COVID, that these supply webs that are multi-continent are actually fairly fragile. And so that overcorrection has a cost to resilience. And so in this idea of like, if I'm going to start a company or an enterprise or grow a company or an enterprise, what do I aspire or orient towards? If I aspire towards more locally self-reliant bioregional kind of systems, ecosystems, where within a bioregion or a region, more of the goods that are provided to the community are resourced, recycled, manufactured, developed in that region. Does that mean all? I didn't say self-sufficient, did I? Right. And so it's like, I'm not saying 100%. There can still be some amount of trade and exchange, reciprocity. There is still quote unquote comparative advantage. Some places there's from climate zone, from soil type, from lots of cultural characteristics. There's lots of opportunity for exchange, especially exchange of ideas. I mean, there's probably the long tail of humanity. There will always probably be some exchange of goods. I actually hope so, across distances, some exchange. But we've overcorrected. So building back local reliance and local bioregional resilience is, I think, a critical characteristic for a business to orient around. And what that looks like, there's really kind of basic things that a company might do for that journey, which might be import substitution. Like if you look at your supply chain and say, what am I getting from far away? Is there any local regional providers that could provide that good or that value add or that service? And substituting the choices for your supply web from, a extra regional kind of provider to a local provider, and you'll probably find that there's gaps. So like, there is no local provider of such and such good or raw material or a service. Instead of saying, well, throw up your hands and say, okay, we'll just continue to find the best price global provider, you could instead say, as a company, well, let's actually pre-competitively find others who need this good or service, and let's invest in developing it in this bioregion so that we can have a local supply. Well, that choice, again, from a price parity paradox perspective, which I'll bring back around a few times, that's probably going to cost more. Likely. Might not. Transportation fuel continues to get more and more expensive, and supply webs are more and more fragile. And so having local suppliers might, in the long run, have a cost advantage. Right now, it might be more costly. So the price parity paradox kicks in. But having a local orientation is a kind of a next economy hallmark. And I don't know I'd be curious for your Beyond the Bee listeners, how many B Corp leaders think about that. They think about, wow, I don't think it's in the BIA, like local suppliers versus.
I mean, it's in the current version 6 about, you earn points if you support your local community, local economy. Some would argue with the definition of local has changed. It used to be 200 miles and now it's like 50 miles, and then it's like the same town. So you have, so it's, if you make an organic cotton t-shirt in North Carolina, it might be local in the sense that like you're using Carolina cotton, but it might not be within 50 miles of your facility. So you don't get credit for it. So it's like, it can be a little black and white.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure what the appropriate mileage is, if you will, if you're near the border of your bioregion and there's something nearby, maybe fuzzy boundaries. But I think, again, the overcorrection is that there's a large amount of material goods that are multi-continent supply chains, and finding ways to embrace a more local supply requires creativity, attention, sometimes additional cost.
Yep.
Yeah. The number 5 is education embedded into the good or service, is something that we talk about for our next economy institution design. The basic underlying idea of this principle is that, similar to the overcorrection on a global supply chain and the externalized harms that come from it, the business as usual economy has drifted towards the best business models, if you will, in a business as usual. You get your institutional MBA, are those that addict consumers to repeated transactions in perpetuity. If you can addict
Sticky marketing.
sticky marketing, again, this manufactured demand, artificial demand. And if your consumers are dependent upon you to provide the goods, then that's good for business, if you will, and business as usual kind of speak. And that dependency is then reinforced with lawyers to protect intellectual property. And if you create goods and say, hey, there's parts and you have the right to repair our goods so that you don't have to buy another one or transact again, you could have something for a lifetime. It could be a hand-me-down. Well, as you can imagine, that's really bad for business in business as usual. And so there's teams of lawyers and so forth that protect against that possibility of a right to repair. Beyond repair, an example that we use in the next economy MBA, and it might be a simple one, is a company like Bucci Kombucha. It's just a company in North Carolina, I believe, that produces kombucha, sells it as a good, but on its website, and I think in some of its packaging, it says, hey, if you want to make your own kombucha, here's how to do it. Full instructions. And this might be, just a simple example, but the transfer of power from a dependent consumer culture to a voluntary interdependent producer culture, where people have the capacity to take on the meeting of more and more of their own needs from their own effort, or even this decentralization of the economy. You can imagine, let's take Bucci as an example. And I don't know much about the company, so I apologize to listeners, but I do know that they do have this, here's how to make kombucha, so you don't necessarily have to buy our product. What if they were really successful in spreading that education? Theoretically, right, we have to use our imagination here, their consumer base got really good at making kombucha, and they would no longer sell kombucha because their consumers would be so adept at making kombucha that the need that they were organized for would be satisfied, if you will. And therefore, they would not need to exist in the same sense. They might pivot their business model to something else, to provide other goods or services as a team because they're good at solving problems for humanity. But their purpose was to meet a human need, but also to transfer the skills and competencies to meet that need to the public at large for more of a shared power producer culture rather than a dependent consumer culture. So the underlying kind of observation...
Looks like Bucci was a B Corp, and now they're no longer.
And they're no longer. So it'd be interesting to know. This orientation to the purpose of the institution, the enterprise, the corporation or whatever, was to solve a problem for people or for communities to help them meet their needs. The same thing you can imagine, like a healthcare provider, like an herbalist or somebody who provides some type of therapeutic services, would be like, okay, I could make the consumer dependent and they have to come back to me again and again and again and transact again. Or I could, in the process of treating them, actually educate them on how to, whether it's produce their own herbal medicines or learn the manual therapy so that they could do their own treatments within their family or by themselves without having to transact. that type of motivation is almost opposite to all the incentives of the business as usual economy. The simple way of saying it is like this principle is like the thought experiment is as a business, how can we put ourselves out of business? Is the ultimate end goal. What's the purpose of a business? Is to not exist. But if we're able to solve the problems as an institutional, be to dissolve the institution so that the problems of people have been, of the community have been taken care of. Now, it might take generations from the point we are now to solve all the problems. So I'm not so worried about the security of a business being or an institution being able to. I would love it. I would love to be proven wrong. I'd love to see businesses go out of business by having transferred the skills and competence to their consumers or their stakeholders in that way. But I don't think it's a likely outcome in the near term. But the orientation to it is, I think, what we're looking for. So any B Corp that's out there, at the very least, especially if they're producing some type of durable good, allowing for the right to repair, if they're producing some kind of non-durable good, they could provide some education, at least how to make it, even if the consumer doesn't have the time affluence or the capacity or the materials to make it. It could be selling kits on here's how to make it. So a different type of transaction, instead of selling finished goods, selling the capacity for their community to develop their own goods. That's a different orientation to economic endeavor compared to business as usual capitalism corporations. And I don't know how many B Corps really embrace the right to repair. Certainly, probably, I imagine in the new standards, circularity is privileged in different ways. And so there might be some formal covenants that B Corps could do. I think the key is, instead of saying from a token perspective, how can I check the box or get the points for having a right to repair sticker on my website or something like that. And I don't know what qualifies, but this basic orientation of, as a business, how can we put ourselves out of business is the thought experiment and the orientation. And that's just an example of a difference. When we said at the top of the call, like, B Corp certification, the B Corp movement is important, but wholly inadequate to the transformation that's necessary. I guess another way of saying it is the transformation that's necessary to be compatible with a livable future has some of these components, these orientations, almost like foundational or axiomatic kind of orientations of any institutions that exist. Would be like, hey, our purpose is to meet core needs. Our ownership needs to be inclusive. So if there are any economic surpluses that they get distributed to multiple stakeholders, we need some practice in democratic governance and dialogue, deliberation, and decision making for better decisions, and as also for life transformation for our stakeholders. We need to relocalize and focus on building up local, bioregionally local self-reliance. And if we do our job well, we put ourselves out of business because we're not needed anymore, because the culture has a built-in producer kind of orientation and is more resilient to meeting those needs, or the need isn't present anymore because we've satisfied it. So those are 5 of the principles that are, again, I just don't know how many B Corps think about those things. That's why the movement as it is today is a great step forward, but inadequate for what's needed.
Yeah. A lot of B Corps, I think about those things, and it's just the daily grind. It takes a unique creativity, vision, operational ground game to like sort of actualize multiple things at the same time. And I do agree that some part of it is raising the collective vision or aspiration of the community with some of these ideas, in the sense of, if more people were thinking this way and thinking about these things, and again, a lot are, but like if even more were, it probably would create a higher number of people would be able to meet them, because you just have more people directionally moving that way and pushing the community. And then it's funny thinking about the orientation of how to put yourself out of business. I can hear a lot of business owners or B Corps something like, I'm already getting pushed out of business. I'm trying to stay in business, man. You talking about orienting towards putting myself out of business?
Unnecessary addition. We're already having problems. Well, that's
Yeah.
that price parity paradox, right? So just
Yeah.
just to affirm anybody who's like, God, I mean, it's not a mindset thing, Kevin, Ryan. I'm already thinking about all these things. I want to do all these things already. I already knew that. I'm trying to do these things and it's hard. Like I can't compete. I can't even stay afloat when I'm trying to incorporate more of these things because it takes time and investment. And how do I get a local supply chain? Wow, that's going to cost more time and money. And like, how do I do that? Well, if you're feeling the difficulty, then yeah, I would say that's natural. That price parity paradox kind of rears its head. What we teach in our or facilitate learning around in our Next Economy MBA is how do we address that price parity paradox? And part of it is modeling everything that we mentioned in principle today. There are a handful or some B Corps and certified B Corps that are, actually expressing those principles in their structured policies or operations. And so it means what does that mean? It means it's not impossible. Nothing that we've talked about today is science fiction, that it just exists in our imagination. It actually exists some places. In certain institutions, certain businesses are doing these things, and they're not necessarily easy. And so how do you make those trade-offs and navigate towards those things? Sometimes there's like learning. Sometimes it's inspiration of like, I didn't know this possible. And it's going to require a lot of other things. Sometimes it requires partial or total vertical integration. Sometimes it requires really creative partnerships or joint ventures. Sometimes it requires rethinking total compensation. Sometimes it requires changing the structure of the organization. Sometimes there's like just innovation. Sometimes, and probably most importantly, if you're really feeling it and you're listening to this and you're like, Kevin, that's all very nice, but everything you mentioned about that business as usual kind of caricature is those are things that are reinforced by fiduciary law and prudence standards. And actually, the regulatory apparatus of government is subsidizing and not regulating out these externalized harms. So how could we ever compete when minimum wage in the United States is still $7.50 an hour or whatever it is? Like
$7.25. Don't be too expensive there.
Don't be too charitable. So if I'm going to pay 3 times that or twice that for my minimum, how can I ever possibly compete to even stay alive? Well, that systems change component is ultimately the regulatory apparatus of what we subsidize and how we regulate as a society. That power needs to be wielded as well from a policy perspective. But it's not just a policy perspective. It's part of it is animating our imagination through being inspired about people who are actually doing it. Sometimes it's sharing best practices. And I mentioned some of the other things that we can talk about maybe next time about ways to change practices to be able to express more and more of these beyond the B kind of principles over time.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming on. I am really excited about marrying this B Corp world with some of the Next Economy principles and beyond B Corp, because I do think, we do have a lot of interesting potential solutions for people, and I'm not sure how many are sort of aware. And definitely, we mentioned it a couple times, but we talk about all this in detail in our online course, the Next Economy MBA, and it's offered twice a year. It's a 9-month course for folks who are interested in learning the business skills that you would need to redesign an economy that works for the benefit of all life. And so I think it's lifteconomy.com/MBA if folks are interested. And Kevin, we also have a Next Economy living training coming up too. You want to plug that?
Sure. Yeah, a little bit of a different, but not too far, is the theme we're talking today of more of a producer culture. In our theory of change at Lift Economy, when we look at how do we address the very large kind of systemic nature of the economy, it's not just policy systems change. It's not just different institutions that are more, you could say, radical or more oriented towards the principles that we were discussing, there's also a requirement for a transformation of culture. On this call, we talked about manufactured demand and the distance that we've drifted. Many people have drifted, not all of us, from being in touch with our needs and our own capacities and potential to meet those needs. Next Economy Living is a training for people that want to have their lifestyle, like how they go about meeting their needs, say for food, water, housing, or even their financial behaviors or how they orient around material or consumption, to have their lifestyle match up more with their values. If they value life, if they value a livable future, if they value healthy water, healthy air. And turns out that it's similar to the economic institution design we were talking about, changing how we live, how we meet our needs for food, or how we consume media or reflect on sense making, or all these things. There's different aspects of our day-to-day living that our imagination might be narrow in terms of what's possible because the strategies we know are only the ones we've learned, and the other strategies that we might know of might not be accessible. So how do we kind of marry our day-to-day choices to our values? We've kind of developed a community of learning kind of practice center for that, which we're calling Next Economy Living, which is a new offering. It's maybe like 10 years in the making, but our first group co-learning experiment will be taking place next year in 2025, and registration is open now. And we've got a few people registered already, and we're really excited to kind of kick off this community of learning, community of practice around basic living, like how we can change how we live.
Yep. I'm just noticing we need a short link for this. But if you want, it's go.lifteconomy.com/next-economy-living. We probably need lifteconomy.com/NEL or something like that. So maybe we'll try and make that change before this goes live. Well, great. Thanks, Kevin. Really great to do a short podcast that turns into a long one, and then we'll need a whole new part 2. Yeah, appreciate your thoughts and for joining.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. And anybody who did listen to this, whether the whole thing or in part, if you're like, hey, some of this didn't resonate with me, or like, I don't agree, that's really interesting information for us. I'm really curious for anybody to share why they think these ideas are bad, or why the incomplete caricatures that we may have shared are not the types of things that really contextualize the types of insights that we're trying to share about, and you have a sense for it. Your feedback is very welcome. So please write in to Ryan and let us know what we could do better and different.
Yeah. Beyond@lifteconomy.com with any feedback. All right. Well, thanks again. And we'll catch up with Kevin for part 2.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Bee. We are trying to grow our audience and wanted to ask you a huge favor that you can do right now. Try to think of one person that might like this show. Then pull out your phone and text them something like, hey, I think you might like this new podcast, Beyond the Bee. Check it out at lifteconomy.com/beyond. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Seriously, try to text someone right now. Pull out your phone. Then follow up with them to see how they liked it. This would be super helpful for us. We deeply appreciate your support.